For my next witness, I'd like to call Mr. Stephen Greenhut.
Please, ladies and gentlemen, please.
Mr. Greenhut, do you swear on this copy of the Wall Street Journal to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Not on their international editorials, but on everything else, yes.
This is going to be a long night. Let's see it now.
Mr. Greenhut, would you please state your name and occupation?
Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. The bailiff made a mistake here.
Rusty's on vacation, ladies and gentlemen.
Stephen Greenhut. I'm editor of Cal Watchdog. I watched the train wreck in Sacramento, and author of a book subtly titled Plunder about public employee unions.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the economic and fiscal crisis in California. You're an expert on that subject. To what degree would you say that public employee unions are responsible for the $20 billion hole in the Sacramento budget?
Well, the unions will tell you that there's only a small percentage of the state budget that's attributable to the unfunded pension liability or the debt. But they've been hiding the amount, the impact on the state budget. It's a pretty large effect, but at the local level, it's enormous. Okay. We have cities that spend 80% of their budget on police and fire services, most of which go to salaries and benefits, and the state has a $500 billion unfunded pension liability, real debt.
$500 billion.
$500 billion. That's big, even by California standards.
Wow.
Right, and the unions say it's not a real debt because of the way it's funded, so I suggest maybe we don't pay it, but they don't like that idea.
How many cities in California, in your estimation, and you're an expert on fiscal issues in the state of California, how many cities do you think, if the fiscal path continues and the kinds of wages and benefits that are provided to public employee unions continue, how many cities would you think in the next 10 or 20 years might have to declare bankruptcy because of these union contracts?
Well, I don't know the number that are going to declare bankruptcy, but there was just a Business Insider analysis of the 14 worst cities that are just being plundered. I love that term. By the public employee unions, and 5 of them are in California. San Diego officials have used the B word. L.A. officials have used the B word. Vallejo went bankrupt. You know, when you pay police captains $300,000 a year, and
Wait, say that again, sir?
Yes, the police captain earns $300,000 a year in pay and benefits.
$300,000 a year?
Their average firefighter salary is $175,000 a year. We have lifeguards in Orange County who are earning well over $100,000 a year.
Excuse me, Mr.
Greenhut.
Mr. Greenhut.
Am I doing a diatribe?
I'm sorry. Excuse me, Mr. Greenhut. Have you taken evidence in law school? No. Because I haven't heard any objections, and you may want to raise a few. I'm trying to be impartial here, but, you know...
It's unobjectionable.
You will, but there's maybe some evidence you would like to object to that...
We assumed we'd be able to counter the factual misrepresentation.
All right, proceed.
Sir, can I please get back to my question?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, order in the court,
I'm
please.
just trying to be fair.
Is it true, Mr. Greenhut, that there are many public employee union retirees that receive pensions of over $100,000 a year?
Yes, there's a $100,000 pension club, 15,000 members. It's growing by 40 to 60% a year because the pension benefits have gotten...
These are six-figure pensions for the rest of their lives.
Cost of living adjusted, plus the best health care in the world, and then that doesn't even count all the many disability pensions. I've yet to meet a police chief who hasn't retired on a disability.
How many, sorry to interrupt, but I have a number of questions I want to ask you. Is that very common in the private sector, for a private sector to receive a $100,000 a year pension?
I'm still waiting to meet, outside of the CEO level, I don't ever meet
So basically, virtually only CEOs or the very upper top management of a company would receive a $100,000 pension, whereas in the public sector, it can be fairly routine in California.
Oh, it's very routine, and
is it just California? What about other states?
It's other states too, but California, of course, we're the leading edge of all trends, good and bad.
Are you familiar, sir, with a policy called retire and rehire?
Well, I've heard of that, and we have things called drop programs, where essentially they're double dipping, various double dipping schemes. you know, if you have a drop program or a rehire and retire, whatever, vice versa, it shows, as a matter of fact, that the retirements are too rich because the employee wants to keep working, the agency wants the employee to keep working, but the retirement's so rich. In California, we have 3% at 50. You're retiring with 90% at the final year's pay if you're public safety, and that includes things like milk inspectors and billboard inspectors. So if they're older than 50, they're essentially working for free.
Now, sir, the defense has asserted this afternoon that public employee unions are not overpaid, that the workers are not overpaid, that they, in fact, I think we heard the defense make the case that, in fact, they're paid less than a comparably skilled private worker.
Yes, I believe.
And I would like to know, you're an expert on the subject. You've looked at the data throughout the country. Can you tell us what your research has found on this area?
Well,
are public employee unions paid less than private sector workers?
No, although are they paid? Public employees are paid more, and it used to be the old deal. They got a little bit less pay. They got less pay. They get slightly better benefits, and they get extra days off and all that. Now they get paid more. Mostly, there are some categories where they don't. They get
how much more?
Well, that's a hard number to parse. But you had mentioned that you know, in some cases it's double on the retirement, and some I see on the retirement benefits can be triple. The average.
Objection, Your Honor. This is just hearsay. I haven't heard a single fact yet.
No foundation.
Okay,
Your Honor.
let
me rule on the objection, Mr. Greenhut.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Sustained.
Sustained?
Sustained.
All right. Well, to the extent that you've done research on this subject and looked at the disparity in public and private sector pay and benefits, what would you say on average, if you would, sir, what would you say is the premium that is paid to a public sector worker today, in your best judgment?
Well, what I've seen, for instance, the unions will talk about on retirement that the average government retiree gets about $27,000 a year. And they say that as evidence that these are not outrageous pensions. Now, these averages include, you know, people who retired in the Pleistocene era, and they include people who are short-timers. In the private sector, that number is about 9,000. So even if that $27,000 number, it's still triple just on the pension. But if you're looking at people who are retiring in the last couple years, in California, the average is about $66,000.
All right, Mr. Greenhut, I think you've made your point. I think we have to move on. So any further questions,
Can I ask one last question?
One quick
are you
one,
familiar
Counselor.
with the size nationally of the public sector employee unfunded liability in the pension and health care benefits? And could you provide for the jury what the best estimate is for that number, about how much money is owed by states and cities to cover these enormous pension and health care costs?
Yeah, I've seen numbers ranging from $1.5 trillion to $3 trillion. And
could you say that again? What?
1.5. I'm a journalist, so I don't understand numbers. So $1.5 trillion versus $3 trillion. What do we know about? What does that mean? It's so large.
Thank you, Mr.
Right?
$1.5 to $3 trillion.
Yes,
how high is the entire amount of state and local budgets today? It's not $3 trillion.
Counselor, that's two questions you're asking there.
That's right, and it's an incredible amount of money that must be repaid by law.
Wow.
It must be repaid. So it's
Thank you, Mr.
That is going to
advantage.
cause an enormous problem.
Thank
for
you,
states
Mr.
and cities in the
Greenhut.
future.
Counselor, please be
Absolutely.
seated.
Thank you.
Counselor, please be seated. I don't want to ask you again. Ms. Lee, your witness.
Thank you. Mr. Greenhut, who funds the Pacific Research Institute?
Various donors, free market donors.
Free market donors, corporations?
I'm sure there are some of those.
So you made a lot about this number.
Can I ask who funds the public employees?
They're members.
Oh.
They're members.
Wait, I'm sorry, I know you're asking a question.
I get to ask the question
okay.
today.
I just wasn't sure whether taxpayers funded it.
No.
Right, okay,
So you said that 15,000 public sector workers in California earn a pension over $100,000. What percentage of all public sector workers in California is that?
I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a large and growing number.
It's less than 2%, in fact, of all public sector
Yeah, but
employees in
you know
California.
that the average is, when you're looking at an average, I mean, what we've got is a soaring number, and it's growing by 40 to 60% a
2%,
year.
less than 2%. And of those workers, how many were under collective bargaining agreements when they got those pensions over $100,000? Can you tell me that?
Oh, I don't know the percentage that are under collective
I
bargaining,
do.
but virtually every...
I do.
Okay, you tell me.
Less than half of them are under collective bargaining agreements. Most of those folks are management or elected officials.
But
they are not,
you know, managers are in associations, but those are essentially unions.
Excuse me, Mr.
They're not
Greenhut.
unions.
Counselor, you can't answer the question that you ask. You've got to let the witness answer that, please.
It's the same thing as a union.
It's not the same thing as a
It
union.
is too.
Excuse me.
Orange,
management is not a union.
Counselor,
please. I'm sorry, it's an association.
Okay, it's not a union. Let's
where
just
they
establish
collectively
that.
bargain.
We talked a lot. They don't collectively bargain. They do not collectively
and the
bargain.
collective bargaining by the other unions has an impact. It creates a ratchet effect.
You talked a lot about unfunded pension liability, right?
Yes, I think that's something worth talking about.
I think it is too. I think it's interesting. Is that
You don't think it's a problem?
Is that generally the province of workers, of unions? Are those decisions about how much money goes into the pension fund and what the actuarial assumptions are? Is that something that unions generally do, or is that something that management has prerogative over?
Now, you're trying to make a huge distinction between public sector management and
Mr. Greenhut, answer the question, please.
Okay, I don't even understand that question. It was a little too convoluted.
Well, there's a union, which is what we're talking about here tonight. And then there's management.
Yeah, but I fail to
make
make a distinction between management associations. Where I worked when I was at the Orange County Register, 98% of the people in the county, management and rank and file, were in either an association or a union. Only about 500 employees, some of the very top level, and they enjoy all the pension spiking benefits that the rank and file are able to.
But the trial tonight is not about government. It's about public sector unions.
Right, but the
and
unions elect their bosses.
Let's move on. Let's move on.
I'd want to move on too.
Ms. Lee, save your closing statements for closing statements.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, what does weakening unions have to do with solving budget problems at the state level?
Well, I see in California, I used to say that the unions own the legislature, but that's not true. They are the legislature. The Assembly Speaker is a United Food and Commercial Workers Union organizer. The Senate Pro Tem is a former SEIU attorney. I mean, if I were you in the AFL-CIO, a lot of the private sector union guys are furious too. I wouldn't be defending those people. Any good progressive.
Mr. Greenhut, please stick to the answer of the question.
If you can give a speech, so can I, right?
Mr. Greenhut, I'm the judge here, and you'll listen to what I suggest in order. Stick to the question.
Okay, sorry.
Answer the question so we can move this along.
Mr. Greenhut.
People have dinner reservations.
Okay. Oh, that's true.
Mr. Greenhut, do you believe in democracy?
Oh, come on. That's a really ridiculous question.
Yes or no, please. Yes or no.
That's like asking if I beat my wife.
Just a yes or no. It shouldn't be a
yes,
hard question.
I believe in democracy.
Okay.
Yes,
Miss
yes,
Lee,
thank you
Miss
very
Does a
much.
union member have a right to run for public office just like anybody else?
Sure they do.
All right,
Do
then.
they have a right to take money without asking
Excuse
their
me,
members?
I get to ask the
Final
question.
question, Miss Lee.
Sorry.
So, in a democracy, people can run for office, and they receive campaign contributions, they receive support from various people, from corporations, from unions, from individuals, and so on. Is it your belief that an elected official has no free will and is incapable of representing his or her constituents, given the campaign contributions that are out there?
Well, you know, I know a lot of elected officials, and I wouldn't give them much credit for anything. But I do know that they're deathly afraid of the public employee unions. And this is Republicans as well as Democrats, because Republicans, you know, they love the public safety unions. They want to pose next to the fire trucks and the police officers. And so, I'm not sure what your question was, and I don't know what my answer was, but...
Okay, one last question for you, sir. If we were to do what you're suggesting...
I haven't suggested anything.
Mr. Greenhut, let her ask the question, Mr. Greenhut.
I'm sorry.
Let her ask the question, and then you can answer it.
But she's asking me to respond on something I didn't do. Okay.
If you allow me to finish my sentence,
You're
then
right,
you'll know
I should.
what the question
My
is.
apologies. Yes, thank you.
Okay, always a good practice. If we weaken public sector unions and take away their collective bargaining rights, slash their pensions, their pay, and their health care, do you think that we will attract a more or a less qualified set of applicants in the future?
You know what? I have never seen, there were 22,000 applicants for a firefighter job in Southern California. They had to open the stadium, so I'm not really worried about getting applicant problems for $175,000 jobs where you're paid overtime to wash the fire truck.
Thank you, Miss Lee.
And is that true across the board for teachers, and nurses as well?
Teachers and nurses do not get as generous of a pension,
That's
but
right,
they do
and they're
get
also
very
public
generous
sector
pensions many times with
Question's
those of
been
us
asked
in
and
the
answered.
private
Thank
sector.
you, Ms. Lee.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Moore,
No
do you
further
have-
questions.
Thank you. Ms. Moore, do you have any other witnesses to call?
Your Honor,
You may be dismissed, Mr. Greenhow. Thank you.
Your Honor, the prosecution rests its very strong case.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Lee, excuse me. Please call your first witness.
I would like to call to the stand Dr. Carl Shoemaker, professor of law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
This is a little bit
Professor
unusual.
Shoemaker.
This is a little bit unusual, but I'll allow it.
He didn't have to move very far. Will you swear on this copy of the National Labor Relations Board Manual to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Dr. Shoemaker,
Yes.
tell me a little bit about your education and your relevant work experience.
I hold a Bachelor of Science degree from Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. I hold a law degree from Cumberland Law School in Birmingham, Alabama. And I hold a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. I briefly practiced law in the state of Alabama. I'm still a member of the bar there. I've been active politically. In my younger years, I was very active in the Republican Party. And in recent months, I've been paying attention to events just outside my door in Madison, Wisconsin.
Ms. Lee, the court will stipulate that he's smart. Please proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Shoemaker, in your expert opinion, what were the primary reasons for opposition to public unions in the first half of the 20th century?
There were three real reasons for opposition to public unionism. One was a concern that granting union rights to public workers would allow them a legal avenue for striking. And striking was a major issue, leading to some very violent confrontations in the early 20th century. The two other reasons were really legal doctrinal issues. One was a doctrine of sovereign immunity, the notion that the state government and the federal government could not be held to legal obligations that they created. And the fear was that collective bargaining would force them to have to honor contracts in a situation where states typically didn't want to be bound by law. And in some states, North Carolina is an example of this, there's actually a doctrine that holds that state employees owe an extra duty of loyalty to the state, not to the communities that they work for, but actually to the state government itself. Those were the factors that were the real reasons for opposition to public unions.
And are those concerns still valid today? Have they been alleviated after many states began to recognize public unions and collective bargaining rights?
Well, the great bargain that was struck in exchange for the opportunity to form collective bargaining unions at the state level was to give up the right to strike. And in fact, the law prohibits strikes by public unions almost uniformly, and in most cases attaches very strict penalties to it. And since the 1960s, there's been a radical decline in the number of public sector strikes, and it's actually, in more normal budgetary times, it's worked quite smoothly, in fact. The doctrines of sovereign immunity have tended to be relaxed as more democratic sensibilities have taken hold, and states have been understood to be accountable.
And public unions were granted the right to bargain over conditions of employment and wages. What about pension benefits?
In most states, pension benefits are actually set by the legislature. They're not subject to collective bargaining at all.
And when states began to allow public sector workers to unionize and to bargain collectively, how did that turn out? Was there a real, could you trace a trend of increases in strife and strikes and so on?
No, to the contrary. There's actually been a demonstrable decline in that. There was early opposition from some states because of what we sometimes colloquially call the spoils system. Collective bargaining and public sector unions actually stood in the way of the old way of appointing one's cronies and political supporters into all kinds of public positions, from high-ranking positions even down to B-cops and teachers. And public unionism actually was a very effective way of stopping this kind of cronyism and what we call political spoils.
Thank you. And what about the role of mediation and arbitration with respect to public sector unions? How does that compare in states with those union rights compared to states that don't have rights for collective bargaining for public sector workers?
Yeah, there's actually not much difference in terms of compensation levels between states in which there is a right and states in which it's prohibited.
And do you find that overall public sector workers are overcompensated compared to private sector workers?
No, the reliable studies show that there's anywhere from a 4 to 8% penalty for working in the public sector, and that gap actually widens with education and qualifications.
So at the highest levels of education, jobs, for example, like a cancer researcher at the National Institute of Health or a legal scholar, there's even a bigger gap for
Yes.
public sector workers.
For economists, for example, it approaches 20%.
How do you explain the disparity in the figures that the prosecution has used versus those you just cited?
They're interested in using inflammatory rhetoric rather than paying attention to the data.
What is the difference between the
Final
studies?
question, Ms. Lee.
The studies that find that public sector workers are not in fact overpaid, are they careful empirical studies? What do they take into account that the other studies do not?
They compare levels of education, age, qualifications for the job, levels of responsibility. The studies that show overcompensation tend to be comparing fire chiefs to McDonald's employees, and it's just simply not a meaningful comparison.
Okay,
Thank you,
thank
Ms.
you.
Lee.
No further questions.
Last money